MassTLC for having me here. Thank you, Sarah, for making this so seamless, and Tom for welcoming me here, and of course Jim. Jim and I have worked together, as he noted, for several years now, and in lots of different ways. And it's nice to be on his sort of home turf.
These are my peeps.
And to come to Massachusetts. I will also tell you that I went to school in Western Massachusetts. I'm from Texas. And so I went as far away from home as I could possibly get. And if you've ever been to Texas, and I grew up in Waco, Texas, and to be fair, I actually grew up in Lorena, Texas, which is a suburb of Waco. Bet you didn't know that Waco had suburbs. And then went out to Western Massachusetts, and not only are they geographically separated, they are about as different culture-wise as you could possibly imagine them to be. And it was nice to come back, and then I came and did my graduate work here in Boston, and it was so nice to be walking around last night being like, oh, this is lovely. And to see actually what really old buildings look like. I live in Seattle now, and when I moved out there, the real estate agent said, I think you're from the East Coast, you'll like an old traditional home. And I said, yeah, that sounds about right. I come from Washington, D.C. at that point in time. And she said, well, I have a 1917 Craftsman that's right up your alley. And I said, 1917 should one of the oldest houses in Seattle. And I thought, oh, okay, our timeline is screwed up. So it's very nice to be back. Thank you. And I want to spend the next few minutes kind of talking through, and I'm not going to talk for all this time because I'd love to have a discussion, but talking through when we think about technology for good, what does that mean and what does that look like? But I want to start with a perspective in the taking the world view of what does the world look like from a humanitarian's point of view in 2016. I'm going to use 2016 because it's the last full year for which data is available. And not to be too dystopian at the beginning, but it's not great, right? 165 million people last year needed humanitarian assistance. Almost 2 billion people live at the edge. And that humanitarian assistance comes in lots and lots of different ways, whether it's food or healthcare support or housing or any number of other things. 165 million people is a lot of people. Attack the United States. 65 million people were displaced by violence, persecution, or crisis. That's 65 million people that were forced to flee from their homes. Most of those folks were internally displaced. Almost 2/3 of those numbers come from just 3 countries. And most of those folks end up in poor countries. So it's not like folks that are fleeing a really bad situation end up somewhere that is capable of taking care of them. They end up somewhere that isn't capable of taking care of them, which puts further strain on their local communities and takes a bad situation and makes it worse. 700 million people live in extreme poverty. It means they live less than $1.25 a day. And while we've cut that number in half over the last several years, I'm not sure that 700 million is still good enough. The really terrifying piece about this is that 87% of those people live in fragile states, states that are on the verge of falling apart. In 2016, there were 25 new countries that were designated as fragile states. 16 came off the list, so we still had a net increase of 9. Great that 16 came off, really bad that 25 went on. There are another 340 million people, give or take some change, that were affected by natural disasters in 2016, and that was up dramatically over 2015. It was up by 236 million over 2015, and if you'll recall, 2015 was the year that we had both Ebola and the Nepal earthquake. Most of those numbers actually came out of India and a particularly bad monsoon season, and folks that were negatively affected by natural disasters. That's what the humanitarian community is facing every year. And the challenge with that is there's nowhere near enough money to deal with the immediate crises. The UN estimates that we run about a 40% deficit year over year in terms of the need versus what's actually provided. Some months it's worse, some months it's 70 or 80%. They actually now track that by month as in terms of what the appeals are versus how much funding is actually provided. Some months we're down, some months we're closer, some months we're only 30% short. But I don't want to be the person that tells one of those 700 million people, or the 165 million, or the 337 million, or whatever number you want to use. I'm terribly sorry. You're one of the 40% that we can't fund this month. That's a tough conversation to have, and it doesn't do much for making us all, this world, a better place. Now, NetHope, this is my logo slide. I don't expect anybody to be able to read this. You're supposed to be impressed now with the number of logos that are on the slide. But let me put a little context into that. NetHope was created to solve exactly this problem about 16 years ago. We are a consortium of the world's largest 53 humanitarian development and conservation organizations. It's every organization you've ever heard of, from Medicine Sans Frontiers, Doctors Without Borders, to World Wildlife, to CARE, to Save the Children, to the International Federation of the Red Cross and Crescent Societies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those organizations came together 16 years ago and said, there has got to be a better way for us to use the tools that we have available to us today to solve some of these problems. So if we all get together, my guess is that we would find that we have some very similar challenges. And if we then go collectively talk to the tech sector, my guess is that they have some pretty good answers in terms of being able to help us. And so that's what we did. It is it's a key leverage point from an ability to move a needle perspective. Those organizations represent about 65, 67%, depending on the year, 2/3 of all international aid that is delivered through international NGOs. So if that aid goes through international through an international NGO, chances are that it's coming through a NetHope member, and a NetHope member that is committed to work together to say we can do this better, and whatever I learn, I'm going to share with the other 52 members. Someone asked me, we just recently had our summit in Vancouver, and someone said, how do I get to be a NetHope member? How does that play out? And the Ebola crisis in 2015 was a fascinating example for both of these issues. Ebola breaks out. Ebola comes up every now and then. Did anybody know we had an Ebola outbreak in May?
Yeah.
Right, we had a new Ebola outbreak in May. So Ebola's been around for a while. This one got out of hand, really got out of hand, and threatened to bleed over into the broader international community. There were a couple of interesting things about the Ebola crisis. The first was it kind of hit the consciousness in the United States right around Labor Day, is September 2014, right? August, September 2014. It was growing through the summer. By the time that we were heading into the back to school season, it was front and center on everywhere. At the end of September, in the New York Times, there was a great story. We've turned the corner on Ebola. Ebola infection rates drop for the first time since humanitarians, started screaming about this back in March. Hooray! And it was true. The numbers were down. The numbers were down though because 9 of the 16 districts in Liberia had no connectivity and couldn't report, and so they were down on straight numbers, but not actually once you got the data in. If you looked at the coverage maps for Liberia, all of Liberia, or most of Liberia, had good 2G coverage, which is why it was taking 4 and 5 days for text messages to get through. And healthcare workers that were going out and delivering how to prevent Ebola messages and were getting paid by mobile money weren't getting paid. And I don't know about you, but if my choice is to go out and expose myself to Ebola and not get paid, I will just stay home. And that was what was happening. We couldn't get people to go out, we couldn't get information out to people. Connectivity became a huge issue. And one of the things that was interesting about this, and an example of how the data sharing has moved, it is impossible to read this, don't try. But what it will tell you is, when we looked at the maps of West Africa, and we looked at where infection rates were rising or falling, where there was coverage or not, and where Ebola treatment units were being planned or not, there was no correlation between where Ebola treatment units were being planned and where infection rates were rising. There was a strong correlation between where Ebola treatment units were being planned and where there was connectivity. Because sick people had no connectivity. And they couldn't say, we need an Ebola treatment unit. I mean, in capital cities, we had Ebola treatments on either block, either end of the block, and no sick people. And we said, but only once we put all of this up, and we put a bunch of organizations around the table and said, anybody see a problem here? I mean, and it was, like Monopoly, where you get the houses and the hotels and stuff. People literally started, okay, well, I'll move mine here and you move yours there, and so on and so forth. Only then could we actually start to cover all of the coverage areas that needed to be covered. And then this was, it's a screenshot of an interactive piece that we did so that we could update it weekly as the infection rates came in and as the coverage reps came in. We went to the Liberian government because we had a private sector donor who said, we'll help solve the connectivity problem. And LibTelco told us, no, that's great, but there's a regulatory process. So if you guys will fill out the application, we'll get our LibTelco FCC equivalent, whatever it is, to go through that and let you know whether or not you can bring in that connectivity. That was a 6 to 9 month process on a good day. Thankfully, we had a donor with a really big checkbook who hired a plane, and we brought in 30 VSATs and 100 VGANs, and we just set up a secondary telecommunications network all across Liberia and Sierra Leone over the course of 6 weeks. And over the course of 6 weeks, provided Wi-Fi coverage almost over those 2 countries. For any number of security reasons, we couldn't get into Guinea. But essentially, that was a session where the nation state could not deal with it. The WHO had to come in and coordinate. But because we had no nation state actors with which to work, the private sector stepped in and essentially bypassed the entire system. That's great if you got saved or you didn't get sick from Ebola, but that is not really the best way to run an effective system. You don't want to say, well, when things get really bad, we'll just bypass all the rules, right? That's not effective. So how do we resolve those tensions, knowing that the expertise exists in the private sector, knowing that the will exists in the humanitarian sector? How do we bring those two together? in the refugee crisis that's currently ongoing in Europe, anybody know what the first question refugees ask when they hit the shore is? The first question they ask is, where am I? And if they're in Europe, they get off the boat. If they're not in Europe, they get back in the boat and go back out to sea and hope they find Europe. The second question they ask is, do you have Wi-Fi? That is an absolute true statement. It's not, hey, I'm hungry, hey, you got a blanket, you know, can someone give me some medical care? It's, do you have Wi-Fi? And the first thing that they want to do, which is exactly what's happening here, and this was in Greece, is they want to send a picture back home to let their family know that they're safe. It is the #1 thing that refugees ask for. Can I let somebody know that I'm safe? Right now we run 70 Wi-Fi spots all across Greece and Slovenia and a handful of other places to support the migration that's coming into Europe. And we've been running those now for about 2 or 3 years. The #1 application that is used on those networks is Facebook. The #2 application that's used is WhatsApp. And it's all to communicate back with, mostly all to communicate back with family. Early in the crisis, it was to get information about which borders were open and where you could get aid and so on and so forth. Most of those refugees have now found, the ones that came in the big summer push in 2015 have found their ways into camp. And camps are now living there, and they're settled, you know, as much as one can be settled as a refugee. And they're using this to communicate with family. When I was in Greece, I don't know, sometime earlier this year, I met a little girl. Her family was actually an Afghani, and for any number of different reasons, if you don't come from Syria, you're not a refugee. If you come from a non-conflict country, you're actually an economic migrant, which means you get treated differently, and there's different rules and so on and so forth. This particular family was living in what used to be the soccer stadium that was built for the Athens Olympics a couple of years ago. Because of the Greek economic crisis, all of the Olympic venues have essentially, they don't get used. And I have to tell you, it was the most surreal experience in the world. You know, you walk up and it's white, and it's sort of your classic Greek view of the world, right? It's all bright white and it's sunny and it's warm and it's lovely, and the Olympic rings are still up there and they're faded and they're kind of sitting askew and whatnot, because I mean it's been a while and no one uses these things. The International Olympic Committee has donated this fabulous soccer field. So they've got AstroTurf out there, and there's this bright green soccer field that's out there, and there are hundreds of men and boys out there playing soccer because there's nothing else to do, right? You can't work, you can't. There's no school. It's a relatively small encampment, 900 people, 1,000 people, give or take some change. And all the little girls and the moms are walking around the track around the outside of the soccer stadium because again, there's nothing else to do. And I met this little girl, and I was talking to her, and she had perfect English. Her father had ran a logistics company in Kabul, and because he had provided logistics support to USAID-funded organizations, he was seen as too Western. He and his family were targeted. So in December of the previous year, they had set off, and throughout the winter, they had walked from Kabul to Greece. It had taken them 9 weeks. He had a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 9-year-old, all of whom made it, thankfully. And as I was talking to the 9-year-old, and I have a daughter that's, at the time, my daughters were 8 and 10, so she was right in the middle, and we were comparing pictures and talking about the things that she liked to do and whatnot. And I stopped her and I said, your English is very, very good. I said, did your dad teach you English? And she said, well, some. She said, but mostly I learned it from the internet. And she had been watching Sesame Street. Right. I was like, take a picture of the router with the NetHope logo on it. That's a great story. Of course, I did not bring it. But I mean, it was one of those things where you're like, right, because this stuff actually makes a difference. Actually makes a difference. It actually has an impact. The other thing that we did in Greece, and we focused on this a lot when we think about beneficiary-centered programs or constituent-centered programs, is how do we actually provide the folks that are being affected with the tools that they need to decide where to go and what to do? Where are borders open? Where can they get aid? What do they need? And so when we set up Wi-Fi, by the way, it's a whole lot of fun to try and get disclaimers and privacy statements translated into Arabic. It was like, okay, we can do Arabic, do we also have to do Farsi? And in Pashtun and any number of things. That was again, I want to give a big shout out to Cisco, who turns out has a lot of employees from all over the world that can help us with that process. But you know, how do we make sure that these families who all show up with smartphones, right? 80% of the refugees that come into Europe have access to a smartphone, and not a feature phone, a smartphone, right? So how do we make sure that they then have access to the tools that they need via Wi-Fi or anything else for that matter, but you know, that they can connect and they can actually do it? It's absolutely critical in terms of being able to help people preserve their identity and to figure out what it is that they want, where they want to go next. This is St. Croix, and it's another good example of where the multilateral questions, the private-public questions, and the prepare and respond questions come to bear. I am not taking a position on this, so let me caveat that. Let me take that. I'm not publicly taking a position on this. There's a lot of speculation that the global warming crisis, right, the climate change issues, however you look at them, made this year's hurricane season worse, right? And even if we were going to have 3 or 4 hurricanes right in a row, it made the impact of them worse because they were longer, more vicious, whatever the case may be. Regardless of how you come down on the climate change question, no single state, whether it's the U.S. Virgin Islands or Texas or the United States as a whole or any of the countries in the Caribbean, could have dealt with or prepared for that on their own. It has to be done in an international system. It has to be done through multilateral organizations. It has to be done through multilateral mechanisms, maybe not organizations, mechanisms. So how do we solve that if the nation state isn't doing it? Now I live in Seattle, and Seattle has said, well, we're still going to comply with the Paris Accords. For those of you that have never been to Seattle, it is the only place more liberal than Western Massachusetts. I thought I went to Smith. I thought going to Smith, you know, especially coming from Texas, like that was a shock. And then I moved to Seattle, and I thought, man, I just got nothing on these guys. You know, but like, it's great that Seattle is going to continue to comply with the Paris Accords, but our winters, right, are going to get colder or hotter. I was telling Jim this morning and Liz this morning, you know, it's usually we see ski season start around December 20th. Stevens open today, right? Like we are now skiing in Seattle, which is just unheard of. Absolutely unheard of. Now, I know you can't take any single man and tie it to climate change, even if you believe it's happening, whatever the case may be. There's something going on. And none of those things are going to be able to be dealt with on an individual basis, but they have huge implications, right? Huge implications. I had actually planned to stay here all day long. I was looking forward to some of the conversations this afternoon, but I'm actually on a plane to Puerto Rico because I've got to go to Puerto Rico tonight to go see some of this stuff. But what's amazing is the private sector has stepped up, both with the funding to support the rebuilding. NetHope is doing the coordination of this work with FEMA, which is doing great work, and they're really dealing with some of the big infrastructure problems. And then working with private sector companies and private philanthropy on providing sufficient information to people that live in Puerto Rico so they know what is working and what isn't working. So it's a great example of where all of those tensions, you know, which way should we be looking, really come to bear and affect the way that humanitarians think about the world. And certainly, if you think about Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina was a great example of not being prepared and then unfortunately also not being able to respond. We knew what was happening with Katrina. We were not wrong. We were absolutely right on where it hit. We were absolutely right on the wind speed. We were absolutely right on how long that we thought Katrina was going to hang around. What we didn't get right was we didn't know what the impact was going to be on the infrastructure that was going to fail as a result of the predictions that we made. And we were not prepared to deal with the aftermath. If someone had thought about it, they would have said, oh yeah, if we get a storm like that, the levees will fail. the levees will fail and Ward 9 will flood and we will have a disaster that we have never seen before on our hands and we are not prepared. But we thought we were doing so great to know exactly where it was going to hit and exactly how fast it was going to be and exactly how much rain was going to fall, but we didn't think through the next piece of that. We just didn't prepare for it. And as a result, the response was much, much worse. It was much more expensive, it was much harder, and there's folks that live down the street from me. They came to Seattle after Katrina and just decided, well, we're going to live in the rain, we might as well live in cold rain as opposed to hot rain. Essentially the same thing. But think about the displacement, right, of folks that did that. So we decided to tackle all of those questions in a somewhat different way. Organizations continue to work very closely with the private sector, continue to work very closely with the technology sector to try and think about how in those individual responses, whether it's connectivity in Puerto Rico or data in Ebola or whatever the case may be, that we solve those particular issues. But we're still not going to close that gap. We're not going to close that gap because we're not actually fundamentally changing the way that we do aid. We're doing it better, faster, cheaper. We're doing it more efficiently. But at the end of the day, we're still kind of doing it the same way we have always done aid. So this year, NetHope is, actually 2 weeks ago, NetHope opened what we refer to as the Center for the Digital Nonprofit to essentially try, and I really hate this phrase, but to disrupt ourselves and think completely differently about the way that aid could and ought to be delivered. And using technology to do that. How do we shift that? What do the business models look like? Right? What do the delivery models look like? How do you put a constituent at the center of programming? And how do we make sure that all of the knowledge that's happened in the private sector gets brought to bear in the humanitarian system? Because we know that the humanitarian system has to change. We know that we've got to fill that gap, and we've got to do it differently. So all of that bleakness, now I'm going to turn to optimism, because the early indications are that there are tremendous gains to be made, and we can shift it. We just have to turn our attention to doing so. So with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak here today. And if anybody's got any questions or comments or wants to argue with me, I'm happy to.
How much time do we have for today?
We have about enough for just a couple questions.
Great. Any questions left? Yes, sir.
We're going to record it, so.
Morning. I'm Hakan Shatrova. I'm a social impact entrepreneur focused primarily on education. How much work is going on to help the future leaders who's going to occupy these governmental positions to understand really what's going on? Because, I'm originally from Turkey, been here now 27 years in Boston, and I see these governments making these decisions, sometimes in the interest of national security, sometimes you don't really know why, but they don't seem to understand, or they've never been almost exposed to any of the things we're discussing, which makes matters worse. Is there a lot of work going on how to help?
There's not enough. I mean, part of the reason that you see, I think some of the again, not to get too philosophical about it, but part of the reason I think that you see some of the shifts in the global politics that you do right now, right, with the middle class being so angry and frustrated, rightly so. I'm not criticizing that, was because we didn't see that shift was coming. We didn't train folks to go do another job. The angst that you see around the fourth industrial revolution, around robotics and AI and all of these kinds of things, are because people are like, wait a minute, the last time this happened, right, we ended up with displaced industries and all of the terrible social impact that's happened. You see, a reversion, so, the nostalgia of earlier years trying to get back to that, but that's because people don't see anything, they see no alternatives, right? And I think it is largely because, from a policy perspective and from a society perspective, I'm not putting it all on the shoulders of policymakers, but we're not looking far enough in the future to say, how do we need to train people, and not just individual organizations, but how do we shift our organizations to be more responsive? How do we shift ourselves to think differently? How do we train people to have those capabilities? And we're not doing it. The conversations that I have with government and institutional and government donors around the humanitarian system is just, oh, well, how much more money do you need? We're talking about 1 billion people. You can give me all the money in the world. Like, But, you know, we should not be thinking in terms of incremental steps. We should be thinking in terms of using what we have today to get exponential gains with the resources that we have available.
Lauren, thank you for a wonderful talk. That was excellent. My name is Mike Kincaid. You mentioned earlier that there are 18 out of the last 20 recipients of aid are still the same. Have we studied the conditions in those 18 to understand why that is the case, and therefore get at the root causes and what you're doing to make sure that isn't the case going forward?
Mm-hmm. We have, and it's not true in all situations. The fragility of states is a big piece, and the only time that you ever see aid in conflict situations or situations that have devolved into violence, right? So sometimes you have a drought that things go sideways. Is the only time that you ever get out of that cycle is when you provide protection and security for the affected community to be able to recover. Right now, we only fund, if you look at sort of the global humanitarian budgets, it's somewhere around 15 to 20% that we provide for protection. And with that number needs to be much higher. And there's lots of great case studies from past things that have worked, where we have provided protection for communities so that they do have time to recover and get back on their feet without succumbing to violence. But if you look at those 18 to 20, it's because you have ongoing conflict. Most of the time, it's because you have ongoing conflict that undermines whatever gains might be made.